Okay, my mic's very sensitive, so if it picks up a lot of background noise, I'm sorry. I want to talk about something I've talked about before, another video I made about reality and how it works. And I want to talk about someone named Amy Eskridge went missing. She was one of like 12, like a dozen scientists who were killed or whatever recently. Not to make it cavalier, that it's a very serious topic. Rest in peace to her. But she was working on anti-gravity. A lot of scientists that went missing were also working on the mechanics of aspects of our reality, like gravity and whatnot, and really why it's so dangerous. That information they have is because once you understand how gravity works, you understand how time works, which you understand how dimensions work, and then you have a little too much power in terms of access to our reality in the realm of which we operate within it, and that information has been privy for a long time now. And the ones who are aware of it work at DARPA, but those are not the people you necessarily are worried about. It's like the individuals who want to control what's going on in at a political level or whatever, who are using that math, that interesting information. This goes back to what Tesla was working on. I mean, you can go all the way back to the days before they even had the information around that we have now about numbers. I mean, this is a very long standing information, and I'm not going to get so heavily deep into all of the equations because most people who would see this don't have any information about like pure math and things of that nature and equations. So I don't want to lose people, but I'm going to paint the picture of why it's how it works at a conceptual level, and some of it may be like, oh, that sounds different to quantum mechanics. Euler had come up with formulas to understand a lot of things, but really some of his most famous ones are about understanding the mechanics of wave functions and the rhythm of reality, and that's what I have delved into. Without further ado, I'm going to start showing you. I have Microsoft Paint open here so I can show you guys how it looks. Okay. So I talked about this before, but all of reality and what makes this process here, which is a cosine, and what is a cosine? It's Tesla said if you look at waves and frequencies, you understand reality, and he was so true because this right here encompasses the whole thing, and technically a triangle too. So, but I won't get too far into that just yet. So what really makes this is three phases of what's called expansion states, reset states, and contraction states. These are represented by in dimension. All of reality is information. Oh my God, you can't see me that well anymore. How about that? All of reality is information, and so you can more or less encompass everything into these three states. It's called the Triadic Law. I'm calling it Triadic Law. Numerically, the information shows up in what's in expansion being represented by. We'll do an equal sign here so that we don't get confused. Expansion states are represented by +1. Reset states are represented by 0, and contraction states are represented by -1. If you've seen a number line before, or like an array, you'll see like +1 over here, 0 in the middle, and -1 right here, and you think that goes forever in that direction and in that direction, and that's not true. It's actually more like this. 0 is here, +1 is there, -1 is there. Contracting states to 0, expansion states, and look at that. Technically, this is a sine, like a sine, not a cosine, but like a, you know what I mean, that kind of sine. And if you look at AKG monitors, all frequency has to show itself in this manner. This is a two-dimensional version, right? Because it's on paper, it's flat. If you were actually looking at like I'm gonna try to do a cube here. I'm not too good at cubes, but if you're looking at it like in an actual spectrum, it would be coiling like it would be more or less be like a cone, And each of these states would be like, oh, you're up here, now you're here, now you're there. By the way, the Riemann hypothesis is that the number line they're tracking is through the middle of all real numbers, which is just 0.5, which is right down the middle of that. Sorry, I don't want to get too far off topic here. Because I'm more or less explaining big picture, like the matrix, whatever you want to call it. So these are the essential information you have to know. Okay? And more than this behavior, this triadic behavior. Oh, that's thin. Hold on. Where was I using before? Brush, right? This behavior is being displayed in more ways than one. This is not just how numbers work. This is how the rhythm of all things have to function. I'm trying to think how to segue this. Because I've talked about this before, but I want to bridge this, okay? I'm going to make a big jump in assumption. Not an assumption. I've written papers about this, but for you guys, it's an assumption. The reason why they couldn't find the non-trivial zeros in the Riemann hypothesis is because they don't realize that prime numbers and composite numbers are really following this behavioral construct. Prime numbers have the capacity of 0 and positive 1, or aka expansion states, inside them, which makes them structural. You cannot break them. This goes back to the triangle. The triangle is 0 and -1 and +1 simultaneously. Okay? If you look at our reality, we have 3 states of consciousness, right? We live in the 3rd dimension. So this is where it gets important. This is where it becomes physics implicative, because we have dimensions, right? And this is when I mentioned this was 2-dimensional, is because we have 2 dimensions. You have a longitudinal axis here and a lateral axis here. If you think about our dependencies within our reality, we have time and we have space. These two are tethered on this axis. We also have energy. So energy dispersion. So we have more or less gravity, which is potential energy. I'll put P here to not confuse, because it's not P, but we'll use P. So you have potential energy, which is gravity. You know what? Let's just use G, because you guys will recognize it. G for potential energy, which is what gravity is. And you have kinetic energy, which is the expression of energy in our reality. Technically, G is represented by contracting energy. Gravity is just contracting energy, which is why you don't actually see anything. Like a graviton is not a particle. It's just a process of anything that's it's contracting energy into what the reset state is, which is a vacuum state. So we have a vacuum state operating between all of these things, represented by 0. So we'll put a 0 here, okay, in the exponential spot. The vacuum state is the denominator of all these things. And the vacuum state, which is represented by 0, is where all operations can descend to reach a lower level or a higher level. You can't leave a dimension. So if you want 2nd and 3rd dimensions, say the 4th dimension, which is just having all these encompassed in one, in this one, is you can't access it without entering the vacuum state in some capacity. Hopefully I haven't lost you. I'm sorry if I have. Just try to make it through, because it will make sense as time goes on. And what you should know about the next dimension is that, well, we'll get to that. So we'll say time is on the lateral axis, which is the x-axis, and then space is on the y-axis. So we'll put a y there, right? And us being in the 3rd dimension means that we have access to these things superpositionally, meaning simultaneously. You can, but you have to. But there's still rules to that. So in a 3rd dimensional okay. there's so many more things I have to explain, but there's a spectrum of distinguishability, which means that anything that exists has to have its adjacent counterpart. Meaning, if there's a y-axis going forever, like this is the y-axis, right? The x-axis, what you're looking at is just this part of, like this is just that part, right? But technically, they both exist beyond that. So you have to have, now we have more, this is a cubed counterpart, which is also why you have what would be on a two-dimensional plane, this is a circle, but in a third-dimensional plane, it's a sphere. If you're still with me, okay? Put X right there. This is so convoluted, I'm sorry. I'm not really good at explaining this, but I'm trying it. This is gonna matter. So you have technically cubed, right? This is something in quantum reality will be called the visibility squared plus distinguishability squared is less than or equal to 1. So you are one counterpart, okay, existing in, and you can operate anywhere in between there, which means you also can only go in one direction, which is forward. So you think in your current state of consciousness, you think you're going forward in time, which is the future. You're technically operating in a single position, and what you think time is as a timeline is not even really a timeline. It's more or less this, and you're operating within it. And in our third dimensional reality, you can only live in the present. Your consciousness is in the present. It's this structural. It's this thing right here. It's you have both a structural expansive capability, which means you can go forward in time, but you can technically only operate in your current present mentally, right? You can only exist in that current present. I'm gonna get rid of a lot of this that it doesn't look too bad. Going back to this triadic explanation of these three states, because we live in this third dimensional reality, and meaning that we encompass both these two states simultaneously of the longitudinal and y-axis, or space and time rather. There's also because we're in the third dimension, we encompass both of those simultaneously and a third one, which means we have both the contracting state, the reset state, and the expansion state simultaneously in our perception. How that works is that for your consciousness, this is where it matters, right? Your consciousness is these three states, but because you're in the third dimension, it's cubed. So let's say your consciousness is C cubed, which means that anything that's cubed has each of these states have their own versions of that. So the expansion state also has its own expansion, reset, and contracting state. And the same with both the reset and contracting states. Technically, the reset state doesn't need that. It only operates as zero, because zero can be any of these things simultaneously, because it has no form. It just has rhythmic behavior and it's not realized. And the wave function and the collapse of it is the reason why it has to collapse, because it maintains no structure. It has no discrete form. It's not a container. It's just behavioral, which also still means it has a rhythm and behavior, but it's not contained, right? Like 0 and 1, it's binary. 0 has to remain 0, no structure, but there's structure in its behavior that's then manifested into 1. And if you look at it, it's funny, because this is technically, let's say this is the number 1, like literally, it's gaining both a expansion state here and a contracting state here from a reset state there. So this is 0, this is +1, this is -1. And you can kind of see why the rhythm begins from there, or rather like this. This is so sloppy. If you made it this far, I love you. Anyway, so consciousness, and you can just, I'll put a skip marker once I know the timing on this, so you can skip right ahead. Consciousness, the version of consciousness that's cubed is that when you're conscious, so let's say you have conscious state, an unconscious state, and a subconscious state. Your conscious state has its own unconscious and subconscious state. Your unconscious state has its own conscious and subconscious state. And your subconscious state has its own conscious and unconscious state. How does that show up? Well, when you're awake, your unconscious state, represented by 0, which is so your conscious state would be +1. Your unconscious state is -1. And your subconscious state is technically 0. 0 and 1. Right? So because when you're awake, like right now, I can go in my brain and I can form an abstract thought. I can either remember the past, which is technically a contracting position because it's here. I can abstract the future based on pattern recognition, or I can be consistently present right now. Meaning your conscious state, it can access your unconscious state, which is things that I'm technically, even right now, I'm awake, but my unconscious state is filtering. It's filtering, it's going through a bunch of information. Things are being taken in and accessed into my memory bank. My default mode network is abstracting my next words without me having to be conscious of it. My visceral motor responses are being contributed from my brain. These are all unconscious. Somatic responses and the like, right? My subconscious, like the thoughts that I'm partially aware of and partially linked into my current conscious state, I'm fractioned between them. That is the 0. The 0 can go in between states, okay? He can go in between. There's this fluidity because it has no form. It has access to those. So that's the 3 states there. When I'm unconscious, like when I'm asleep, my conscious state is when I'm dreaming. So I'm unconscious. My dreaming is my conscious state, and my subconscious is still awake because I can have like a meta awareness of the fact that I'm dreaming in a state. And that's your subconscious sort of being awake. That's the 0. And remember when I mentioned that prime numbers contain both 0 and 1? Technically, your subconscious is a version of that, where it's structural, being that it can contain. Well, your conscious contains both your subconscious and your conscious state. So that's the 0 and 1, technically being demonstrated there. But your unconscious is the 0 state that can enter between your conscious and unconscious, and your conscious and unconscious states, meaning that you can have thoughts and abstract things. Your dreams are often like an amalgamation of your both your waking and your unwaking thoughts. So it's existing. Once again, here's that triangle again. It's existing between both of these states of understanding. So your conscious state and your unconscious state are coming up with these sort of amalgamated, weird, like fluid thought, like experiences that your subconscious is bringing to your unconscious conscious state, which is your dream state. And then your subconscious can like I said, being that it's 0, it enters in between both of them. So your subconscious conscious state is the thoughts you're aware of like, I can abstract things that do not exist. I can think of right now something that does not exist. Like it's an amalgamation of things that do exist. So I can think of like, a purple elephant. That doesn't really exist in reality. Maybe in drawings and art, things like that, but it's not. But there's variations of which that doesn't exist in our physical reality. I can think of myself having memories or dreams or ideas of things that I've never actually experienced. I'm just constructing that. That's and even though I'm conscious, my subconscious can pull that together. And of course, it's unconscious state, because when you're technically unconscious, that is your unconscious state. So that's this is the experience of going in between each of these states. And so that's why it's cubed, because they all have their own version of that. Okay? Now that we've talked about consciousness, I'd like to get into gravity, right? And how these same constraints are applied. Because time and space are on these axes, are on shared axes. So time is the x-axis, right? Space would be the y-axis, which means that anywhere you go, one is going to be, they're on a matrix of behavior. They're constrained. If I go there, this one's implicated. If I go there, this one's implicated. So we understand that. Gravity and kinetic energy are on an axis. I mean, energy has to be dispersed, created, like when a ball rolls down a hill, okay, there is the potential energy that's technically pulling this object is being converted into kinetic energy, okay, which is picks up velocity and the like. Why does if you but it has to be but it has to be structural. It's not random. This is why there's a limit, right? There's a limit to how much force is being applied here. And because of that, there is a limit to the behavioral context that makes gravity does what it does. Meaning that it has to be a process following a certain behavior. Even though gravity seems to be nothing, it's following a behavior. Which that vacuum state I mentioned once again, represented by 0 here in our reality, represented by 1, are both the non-terminal or the non-discrete realm, and then our terminal and discrete realm, container of behavior. And which means that these same behavioral patterns have to exist in here for them to exist here. Meaning that gravity has to follow a certain behavior for that to exist. And if you'll notice, without air resistance, like, it doesn't matter the mass of an object. Like if you drop a bowling ball and a feather at the same rate in a vacuum, once again a vacuum that has no air resistance, which they've done, if you can see a video of that, they will fall at the same rate, which means that it's not mass dependent. It is the constraints of gravity as a whole. That has no accumulatory effect, meaning that it has to follow a consistent constraint of behavior. Okay. How this is implicative or implemented with time and space is that only exists in our third dimensional reality. If you were to try to descend or ascend informationally, because all reality is information, like we mentioned before, this is information right here on the 2-dimensional plane. We are examples of information in the 3rd-dimensional plane. It's enacted, right? Now, if all of our dimensions are encompassing the previous dimension plus, then that means that the 4th dimension is all of what we can have in our 3rd dimension plus. We mean that past, present, and future. People said plasma is like 4th dimension. I'm like, what are you talking about? Past, present, and future are the time and space axis of our 3rd dimension, which means that the 4th dimension has past, present, and future happening simultaneously, or what's called superpositional. So because of that, maybe you personally, as a being, are constrained to this 3rd dimension, right? I mean, you can't physically enter outside of this dimension without having to reduce to 0. That's the reset, right? So you have to be able to transition between them. Like we mentioned with your consciousness, subconsciousness, I can transition between them because it's 0. The mind is unconscious state because it's unlimited. There's no limit to the mind. You can't say this is the mind. Even though the brain is the construct that houses the mind, technically the behavior does not have a limit the way our discrete bodies do. The mind, once again, can enter beyond that, but the body can't. So then how does that matter? Why does that matter? Because being that gravity and kinetic energy are tied, time and space are tied, all of these are technically tied together. Okay, triangle, we'll do it here. We'll do G and K over here, right? And technically, I would say gravity is the I would say that gravity is the G x-axis, like I said here. I would switch these. Okay, so 4th dimension being past, present, and future means that you can see all of them superpositionally, which means that the future, but because of this being true, it would mean that the future has happened already, and we are sort of waiting to get there. And if that's true, then how does that negate free will? Because now we're looking at determinism versus free will. Determinism, but I don't really understand why people make the argument between determinism and free will, because nature is inherently contradictory. This is a contradiction. These existing simultaneously is a contradiction. So the reality is contradictory by nature. In fact, you can't have anything in our physical existence without its opposite existing is also, because we mentioned again, the spectrum of distinguishability means that you have to have two, like hot and cold have to exist for either of them to exist. That's kind of the whole point. So determinism means that we know what's going to happen. Free will means you have the choice to make that, to have the option to make the choice about what do I want to do. Now, does me knowing what choice you're going to make stop you from making the choice? Like, let's say I know what's going to happen. I say choose between one door or the other. You still make the choice. You have the free will to make the choice. Determinism says, I just know what choice you're going to make before you made it. That doesn't negate one or the other. You still made the choice. I just knew what you were going to do. Determinism says, I know all the choices that's going to be made. You will make them, but I know. Now, it gets pretty theological from here. And that's why it's a slippery slope, and I don't want to assume too much, because I could say I have an idea of what all that looks like, but it could be damaging if I verbally make the assumptions for you, because it becomes quite a quagmire of thoughts after a certain point. This is going to become a very long video. It already is. Okay, still haven't explained anti-gravity and gravity, right? In time and space. So if information can enter, information is in your mind, information is everywhere. The behavioral rhythm of numbers is I would say, a one-dimensional construct. Like, numbers behaviorally maintain the same behavior at every level. So what the behavior of this triadic formula is going to enact itself on the first dimension, the second dimension, our third dimension, and the fourth dimension. And the fourth dimension, having all these things superpositionally, means that you can interact with them at the first dimension. You wouldn't need to necessarily go to the fourth. I would just need to descend. And so if you hear about people talking about this real mystical stuff, which I don't recommend ever getting involved with, because you leave yourself exposed, is like astral projections, or like a bunch of stuff that becomes very it's dangerous, so don't do it. But they are taking their consciousness, their zero, and accessing higher dimensional information, and for a good reason. God is like, hey, don't do that. Like, you're leaving yourself very exposed, because you're not safe in that way. Blah, blah, blah. Ooh, this is getting really, I'm not going to talk about that anymore, but I will talk about how all these things are representational. And Amy Eskridge figured out anti-gravity because she basically just said, if you invert this process, not invert it in our dimension, but if you invert it in other dimensional information, then gravity no longer has its hold on you. The only reason gravity or time or space have any hold on our being is because we exist in this third dimensional lattice. This is the third dimension. Because you exist within here, or in here rather, it applies to you. You cannot escape that. But because information exists at all levels, second or first or fourth, you can enter the vacuum state, and then you no longer have the same constraints, which is why we have things like quantum entanglement, because they're quantumly entangled in the vacuum state. The same reason why the Riemann hypothesis and the non-trivial zeros apply, because those zeros are embedded in prime numbers, and prime numbers are structural because they maintain the position of a discrete location and a non-discrete one, which is a triadic that same triadic behavior. Quantum entanglement is two particles here being triangulated between the vacuum state, which is why that works and why it doesn't need localism to transfer information, because there's no informational transfer taking place. They are being the observer. It takes place in the vacuum state, forcing the informational context of one particle to respond to the informational context of the other, meaning that they take on this triadic position of, hey, if you go left, a contracting principle, I'll go right, the expanding principle, because we both have to exist upon this spectrum of distinguishability, and they're being tethered through the zero. Now that I've thoroughly confused all of you, take care.